could easily have a pretty simplistic setup for this particular episode and just talk about the delivery of uh, the delivery of industrial substances by ship down at the
Mhm.
down at the delta, and the delivery of these substances by ship. They're careless with the packaging. They drop a certain amount, a certain percent every time. This stuff is cheap and you need a ton of it. So who cares if you lose 5% of it along the way? So
Mhm.
they don't care much about safety procedures. And this stuff's
Mhm.
horrible. This stuff gets all over and it poisons everybody. And it's awful. You don't want it in
Right.
your beach. You don't want it in your river. You don't want it in your ocean. And they're smearing it all over the place. And it's just going to get worse because they're bringing in this stuff by the ton. So we know this, and the the question is, what are all the things that I might say my character does? Do we just go into tactical mode and look for the battle mat? So now that we can go and sabotage these things and blow them up and be done? Is that what's
Yeah.
going on? Or
I think,
are there other considerations? And just knowing that my character got Grimmer, that's not good enough. That's just fun to play. It's not,
yeah.
consequential for um it's not consequential for how I'm going to make important decisions. Um so that's really that. So before we can say what kind of mechanics are good, we have to talk about what the mechanics might be doing that are filling that hole. What where the and that hole is very much about what players feel like they can say that they're doing. I mean,
Yeah.
it's their and the worst thing would be to say, well, okay, before the combat, you're going to have to do some investigation because that's just
Mhm.
kicking the can down the road, right? That's just adding a
Yeah.
step, in the same problem. So, what are your thoughts on that? Particularly think about my little gnome, who's actually not as little anymore, right? Because he's looking like Popeye with his big forearms or something,
Yeah.
um, and whoever it is that you're playing.
Yeah.
What are we? We're sitting there and we're seeing these things, happening, and how do we keep this from? How does play keep this just from being, well, okay, let's go fight.
Yeah.
What else is going on? What decisions? Why is it important that I'm playing this gnome with his history and not just some other playbook that I picked up and I could be playing just as well?
Yeah.
Right? If you have thoughts on that, answers on that, what it would
Yeah.
look like, yeah, well, tell me.
So again, everything that I have so far is very conceptual. I don't have like brass tacks, but it occurred to me that so I have two concepts that have been kicking around, and I'm not sure how I want to implement them, but I'm fairly confident that I want to
Okay.
implement them. One of them is making peace, and the other one is making mischief.
Ah,
And so I want there to be some. I don't want it to be such necessarily that one can refuse to confront the Empire Band. Like they need to be confronted. There are
yeah, you're
truly
gonna have to do something about this. This
do something.
situation is there. I get that. Yeah.
But I think I want one of the major themes to be some capacity, if the players are interested in a road to reconciliation of some sort, some way to try to heroically balance the needs of the forest versus the needs of these humans in a way that doesn't destroy. Um, and I don't want to force that on people, but I also don't. I know, especially with my play group, it's a bunch of pacifists and stuff that they're going to be asking me like, well, can't we try to
Right.
to fix this? Can't we explain to these people that they're spilling stuff all over and that this is harmful? There's got to be somebody in this empire that has some sense of
Right.
goodness to them. And if I say no, you got to fight them, they're going to be deeply upset and
Well, and
not
not only
want to
that, but
play.
it's not as interesting, right? It's just
Yeah,
not as
that's it.
interesting. Even your more militant players may be interested in saying, well, maybe it's more fun to pick and choose exactly where to strike, because you
Yeah,
could literally say that, well, just fighting all the time really isn't,
yeah.
I mean, it's going to be hard.
And then
So,
continue. I was going to say, and then continuing along that idea, it's also possible. I like the idea of um, fairies and woodland creatures and monsters being mischievous,
right,
and I
right,
want to be room for that. And so it may be we don't go and we don't kill everybody who's running these airships back and forth or these wagons or whatever, but we sabotage it somehow. We make mischief in a way that that both affects how the conflict in the broad sense is resolved, how we resolve this thing that we care about, which is them stopping dumping,
Right.
and also has some effect on hopefully some effect on the larger metagame of how things end up turning out in the end.
Right. This is actually sort of interesting. I mean, I find it interesting to contemplate the idea that for these characters, making mischief as a task actually is probably pretty easy.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, I've been thinking sort of the Narnia picture where, in the books anyway, although the woodland creatures, the magical animals, are formidable, they really kind of do need, upstanding British leadership to kind of get
Mm-hmm.
their shit together to do it.
Right.
They are a little too woodland fauna and mythological, fanciful
Yeah.
being to sort of mount an organized, charge.
Right.
Um, so okay, I'm thinking that therefore there are certain mechanics that spring to mind. And as usual, I'll go by analogy with other games without directly recommending, oh, use this mechanic. It works in this game, right? But
Right.
one of them is clearly My Life with Master,
Mm-hmm.
whereby only by sort of, in a sort of slightly different way, you have to establish connections with other people in order to be more effective against the master, and that um, in many ways you can only sort of apply yourself in very limited ways. You can only do villainy, or oh god, there was two: villainy or violence or whatever he called it. But the point being that you were able to abuse people physically or otherwise, and that was pretty much all your character could do, unless they
Right.
were working on their connections and built up some love.
Right.
So I'm not saying that this particular mechanic is exactly what we mean, but we do see in My Life with Master limited capacity for directing your action mechanically.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not doing it in a particular way, that is not going to work out well for you ultimately. Unless you do it, unless you do something else, you develop something else, you're just not going to have as well-rounded a set of play options. And so I was thinking in terms of, well, okay, these characters are real good at making mischief,
Mm-hmm.
and if they must, they can do some damage, and as they get darker and grimmer, that gets stronger.
Right.
Right? So we get that. But there is another sphere of activity that, I mean, and I kind of like the idea that mischief could be very effective, but it's also very dodgy. You don't know if it's going to be effective, ineffective, or backfire. Mischief has ways of going every which way, right? For
Right.
as far as your goals. So if the characters are mischievous, they can cause lots of chaos that sometimes works out for them. If they're violent and they get more and more and more violent, more and more and more grim as you go, more scarred, and more, until they really are a bunch of savage, terrifying, you know, fairy tale monstrosities, like not even the good kind, right? Not even the
Yeah.
cool kind, as you really go there. I mean, that you can do that, but what if you build up relations? I mean, and again, you don't have to follow the relationship like in My Life with Master.
Yeah.
But if you build up something, and the other good analogy is trust in the Mountain Witch, right? You put a lot of
Mm-hmm.
trust in others, and there's risk there, but you can do it. Um, if you do these things, then you have a character who's capable of more nuanced actions, so that the fiction of what they can accomplish is different than what they could accomplish in the default ways.
Yeah.
Is that sort of working? I mean, so I mean, if you're talking about literal suggestions, and again, this, I mean, you and I can keep reassuring each other about this, and I believe you, but it's good to say. I could work my way through a hypothetical systemic approach here that
Mhm.
would fulfill some of what we're talking about, but physically and experientially, it may not be what really floats your boat. We're just talking about whether it does, this particular more nuanced function. So I've already said some of it. Let's say we have kind of a my life with master situation where you say, okay, well, how are you going to deal with this situation? Well, it's going to be mischief, or it's going to be, you know, huh, mischief or madness, right?
Mhm.
Madness being like the madness of violence, like the madness of Pan, the madness of the Bacchae, right? You go right into it.
Right.
So, you and either and the results, if you're successful with your mischief, then certain, randomized or unpredictable things will be sparked, and some of them may include ultimately knocking down what the empire is doing.
Mhm.
But it also could go any which way because it's mischief, right?
Right.
So there you have some subroutine that takes you through that. Um, and then on the other hand, there's madness, but madness has a way of going too far, right? You end up doing a
Mhm.
lot more destruction, right, than you announced, because you can
Yeah.
announce, I want to kill the captain of the ship, right, or I want to destroy that shipment and I want to blow it up so we don't deal with contaminating the water. I want to destroy that. Fine, go ahead, and the roles and subroutines might take you well past that point,
Mhm.
right? So that's mischief and madness. Now, that's how, if you just stick with those, you will be battling the empire. There is some chance that you might, in the long run, accumulate, enough successes to, take it down.
Yeah.
But fictionally, you will have done an immense amount of weirdness and harm along the way.
Yeah.
And also, you may well, because it's madness that corrupt, that taints you, that darkens you, that makes you grimmer.
Yeah.
um and so if you keep doing that, then you will end up with characters who are kind of burning out along the way, and you're going to be left with a, maybe you draw out the empire, but you are left with the haunted forest from now on, right? You're
Yeah.
left with the worst of the worst, a place where people are, where more murder, madness, and darkness is, you've created a hell pit.
Yeah.
um and so then you say, all right, well, what's the alternative to just playing those along? And the answer is, well, who are you going to make bonds with? Who are you going to, I mean, I'm sounding very 2004 now with my bonds and my trusts and my
Yeah.
connections and all that, but again, this is a hypothetical example just to show you how the dynamics can be turned into interesting choices, so that your character's own arc is their own.
Yeah.
um and so, I mean, the obvious one, if you're just going to rip off My Life with Master, is say, you build these connections with other characters through roles. They could either be other, like more human and nuanced relationships with your fellow woodland creatures, so
Mhm.
that you're no longer just doing kind of stereotypical woodland magical things. You're actually building
Yeah.
specific relationships with them that weren't there before. Or
Right.
you're doing relationships with humans.
Mhm.
Either one is fine, but you're putting some risk into it. You don't want that character to come to grief, because then you lose all that. But you can use those points or the scores that you've built up, or however that works. You can use that for much, much more effective, wide open options in terms of dealing with the empire. For example, you might
Mhm.
be able to, even if you want to keep it violent, you might be able to fight far more effectively without descending into madness, much more scientific strikes,
Mhm.
well
Right.
considered activities instead of just going nuts. Or you could just turn it right into, look, we can actually use the positive aspects. Maybe I can contact the human activists, right?
Mhm.
Maybe I
Foment
can,
rebellion.
right. I mean, or something like that. So do you see now how I kind of built this? I've obviously just cribbed mainly from My Life with Master, but the point is that now we have choices, we have a particular arc of character development, and we also have outcomes in terms of story, which means it's not just about, yeah, we're still racking up points about the, about the empire as we go, but that's become more of a framing device and less of the point of play.